I would like to start by thanking Michael and the other organizers for inviting me to beautiful San Diego to share my work with you. Today I will be presenting a part of a larger project that I'm working on character, diversity, and equal opportunity. And in particular, the paper that I'm presenting today, I argue for a particular kind of character education that focuses on the dispositions that we need to be effective agents. What I have in mind here are delaying gratification, being perseverant, hardworking, and all of these dispositions are probably best exemplified by Lisa Simpson there, that we're all familiar with. And I'm sure all of you as educators have had Lisas in your classrooms, and a lot of us have often wished that our students were more like Lisa here. Recent research in the past 20 to 30 years has supported what a lot of teachers already know. The dispositions to work hard, to be conscientious and perseverant are important for educational outcomes, labor market outcomes, even health outcomes. However, I think we have to be careful about how we incorporate this research into educational policy for exactly the sorts of reasons that Michael was raising. I think we can fall prey to a kind of instrumentalism that is problematic. So for a large portion of the paper, I will argue against what I call the crude instrumental argument. And this is an argument that I think underlies a lot of the discussion about this research in the public sphere, so in the media, and to some extent in policy discussions about how to think about this research. So let me just give you a sense for what I will be discussing today. So first I'm going to talk about, I'm going to give you a definition of what I call non-cognitive dispositions. These are the dispositions that other people call character, personality. I prefer this term, although it's a bit inelegant, because I think when we use the character, you imply a lot normatively that I don't want to imply here. So we'll talk about that. I will give you a brief overview of the research that shows why these non-cognitive dispositions are important for educational labor market outcomes. And then I will turn to giving you a sense for this crude instrumental argument that I will be criticizing. I will be talking about how to evaluate those sorts of arguments, what considerations go into it, raise a problem, and then I will try to show a way around this problem by giving a just as sensitive instrumental argument. So I do think that we can make a successful instrumental argument, but we just have to be careful about how we do it. And finally, I will conclude with some thoughts about how we should move forward in light of this research. All right, so in the empirical literature, the term non-cognitive dispositions is based on James Heckman's term non-cognitive skills. And this has been, this area of research has really been exploding in educational research. But a lot of the empirical researchers just take non-cognitive to be the dispositions that are not cognitive, right? They're define it negatively. So I'm going to try to give you a sense of how I'm thinking about the term. So we can think about the cognitive as the patterns of thought and behavior that are aimed at the acquisition of true beliefs about the world. And I'm sure lots of you in discussion will think that, I don't think that's what distinguishes the cognitive, but here's how I'm thinking about it. So I'm thinking here of mathematical reading and analytical skills. In the empirical literature, these are often measured by IQ tests, standardized tests, SATs. So these are the sorts of this is the sort of knowledge and the sorts of skills that we often focus on in educational contexts, and that the recent assessment mania, thanks to No Child Left Behind, focuses on this domain. But we can also look at the non-cognitive. And so the non-cognitive can be defined, as it is often defined in the literature, as the patterns of thought, emotion, and behavior not primarily aimed at the acquisition of true beliefs, but rather at how we interact with each other, how we are in the world, how we pursue our goals, etc. So some examples here: grit, assertiveness, extroversion, and these are often looked at in the empirical literature by focusing on personality tests. So in the personality psychology literature, you have the Ocean standard, in which people are rated according to how outgoing, conscientious, how open to new experiences, conscientious, extroverted, agreeable, or neurotic they are. And so you can take these tests online and figure out where you fit on the Ocean scale. Just a caveat, part of the problem is that some of these personality types include quite a bit. So conscientiousness includes the capacity to delay gratification, to be able to respect and follow norms, to make plans. It's for the purposes of doing normative philosophy, they can be a little bit too crude. And recently there has been a focus on more fine-grained understandings of these dispositions, but that's just a caveat when looking at the empirical literature. There have also been tests done by looking at subjects under experimental conditions and seeing how they behave and thinking about these traits in that way. Okay, so what is the relationship between these non-cognitive dispositions and achievement? Now, we've seen correlations, and here one of the probably more famous studies was done by Walter Mischel, who was then at Stanford, and he looked at 4-year-olds in an experimental situation, and basically he put a marshmallow in front of them. He told them, if you wait 20 minutes, we'll give you 2 marshmallows, but you can't eat the marshmallow now. Then he saw how, some of the kids were able to wait 20 minutes, get the 2 marshmallows. Some of them were able to wait 15. Some of them couldn't even wait a minute, and they just grabbed a marshmallow. And then he followed this cohort of kids into adulthood. And he found, even when you're controlling for IQ and some of these other cognitive domains, the kids who were able to wait longer did better in terms of education, employment, health outcomes, all sorts of positive outcomes. And so the capacity to delay gratification seems to be importantly related to future life outcomes. Recently, Angela Duckworth at the University of Pennsylvania has been doing work on grit. She calls the capacity to persevere in the face of obstacles. And she has also found that grit correlates, even when you control for IQ, with all sorts of positive educational outcomes. Other research: openness to experience predicts how long students stay in school, better than student grades. Positive measures of self-esteem and locus of control are predictive of higher wages. Extroversion also seems to confer a labor market advantage, though only in certain fields, and the effect is more marked for women. So there's a lot of research out there that shows the importance of these non-cognitive dispositions. Of course, correlation is not causation, and we don't fully understand yet how these non-cognitive dispositions are developed, but we have some research done by Annette Leroux at the University of Pennsylvania in her book Unequal Childhoods. And so Leroux went into working class families and middle class families and saw how parents engaged in parenting their children and found significant differences. So she found that, for example, working class parents tend to be defer to authority. They tend to be not as assertive in institutional contexts, whereas working class parents tend to be fairly assertive with teachers, doctors, educators, and children learn from observing that behavior and from their parents encouraging them to engage in that behavior. And so her conjecture was that a lot of these working class kids weren't doing as well perhaps in school or in the college application process because they hadn't been taught how to deal with these institutions in a way that middle class kids had been taught. There also have been studies done with certain intervention programs, so preschool programs that focus not just on cognitive skills, because clearly when you have, 2, 3-year-olds, you're not necessarily teaching them reading and math. That's not all that's happening there, but also in some of these non-cognitive dispositions, and they have seen that even though the gains in IQ are very modest, when they look at these kids from these programs and compare them to a control group as they become adults, those kids do better. And so James Heckman has argued that investing in education would actually save, I'm not sure what the amount is, but he thinks you get a 7% return for your money or something like that. He's calculated it. So preschool seems to be fairly important. And controversially, KIPP, the charter schools, that are fairly controversial, and we can talk about this research, but they have advocated teaching character as part of their curriculum, and they argue that that's part of their success. Of course, the research there is controversial. So here, just to give you a sense of KIPP's mission, we can see that students get graded on not just academic grades, but things like grit, zest, self-control, interpersonal self-control with respect to schoolwork, optimism, gratitude. So this is, okay. So I think that this research is exciting and very interesting, and this is what got me interested in thinking about philosophy of education. But I think we can fall prey in reading this research to a kind of crude instrumentalism. And you can see this in discussions kind of in the media about this stuff. So Paul Tough recently, last year, came out with this book, How Children Succeed, Great Curiosity, and the Hidden Power of Character. A book I quite enjoyed, but when it comes to dealing with some of the normative issues, it's, it sends my philosopher antenna up as soon as I'm reading it. And here I have a few examples. So let me, okay. Can I see this slide here? Maybe I'll do that, sorry. Okay. So one of the founders of KIPP, Tough, raises the question, well, when you're teaching character, don't you get into this murky ground of teaching values? And he discusses, when he mentioned this idea to Levin, one of KIPP's founders, he cringed at this notion. He disliked the idea that KIPP's aim was to instill in its students middle-class values, as though well-off kids had some depth of character that low-income students lack. The thing that is great about the character strengths approach is that it is fundamentally devoid of value judgment, he told me. The inevitable problem with the values and ethics approach is you get into, well, whose values, whose ethics? There's a sense here that we can justify teaching these dispositions without really talking about values or these sorts of issues. And you can see this as well with, Did it upset itself because I went to the slide to look at it? Let me see. Did that fix that? Okay. I'm not sure if it's the... Try now? Oh, great, thanks. Okay, so here is another quote, and this is from a teacher explaining to a student what it was that they were up to. So here you see, we've been working on the past few years on this project to get a clear picture for parents about the character of your child. The categories that we ended up putting together represent the qualities that have been studied and determined to be indicators of success. They mean you're more likely to go to college, so we think these are really important. So this is a teacher talking to a parent about this character report card, trying to motivate it. Okay, so I think in the background of this is a kind of instrumentalism. And I'm going to try and give you a sense for how I think this crude instrumental argument goes. I think the first premise is that our educational institutions should develop the knowledge and skills in our students that will give them the opportunities to achieve their goals and lead a diversity of good lives. Second, we know that in our society, employment and higher education are necessary to achieve one's goals and to lead a diversity of good lives. And research shows, as I've discussed, that, and here I leave it pretty abstractly, and you'll see why in a second, non-cognitive dispositions X, Y, and Z, whatever it is that we're talking about, lead to higher educational achievement, higher rates of employment, higher wages, better health, and reported life satisfaction. We also have reason to think that these dispositions are malleable and can be taught. This is crucial, right? And if this is going to be a concern of education. And so our educational institutions should be teaching these non-cognitive dispositions. Now, I think it's clear that something like this is in the background of what the KIP is thinking, but also if you've at all read these articles in the New York Times that come out so often, I think this is in the background of those arguments as well. So I think we can poke holes and ask questions about lots of these premises, but what I want to focus on today is actually this third premise, which seems the least controversial, perhaps. And so I'll return to it in a bit, but let me talk about how we might evaluate instrumental arguments. Okay, so the first, and what we're talking about in this conference, is the first point of evaluation is to think about the aims or ends of education, right? So what are the relevant ends? Whenever you have an instrumental argument, you have an end in mind that you're hoping to achieve. Of course, in education, we're concerned with cognitive ends, reading, math, all of those are important. It's not as if only the non-cognitive is important. Obviously, we want our students to be able to do those things. So we have cognitive ends. There are some controversies about cognitive ends, but perhaps not as many as about some other ends. So the debate over creationism in the classroom is you could think of as a debate about which are the right cognitive aims of education, but that is not as controversial as some of the political ends. So here there are a few ways to go about thinking of the ends of education. Citizenship accounts of education, such as Amy Gutman's account of education, focus on whatever it is that we need to be good citizens, the knowledge and skills we need to be able to vote, be part of a jury, understand our civic duties, etc. Then we have views according to which liberalism, if we're committed to something like liberalism, gives us some ends. So, for example, being empathetic might be one such, or being tolerant of other people of other cultures. Now, if you have a Millian or a Kantian view of education, then you think that autonomy is an end that a liberal state should focus on. And we also have aims that come from equality, equal opportunity notably being one. And I think in the crude instrumental argument we just looked at, there's something like a mix between liberalism and equality. We want to provide people, students, opportunities to access the labor market and higher education so that they are able to pursue whatever life they want, I mean, within the constraints of liberalism, so that they have options available to them as they become adults. More controversially, you might think that the community itself can give us aims for education. So parochial schools or other sorts of schools that cater to particular religious communities. That's one example where they think part of the goal of their educational mission is to inculcate the values of that particular community. Okay, but even if you've set the aims of education, we've had a discussion and settled on some aims, I think there's still work we can do in thinking about instrumental arguments. Namely, we have to think about the context of evaluation. Are we talking about giving children, say, an opportunity to enter the middle-class workplace or other educational institutions, to contribute and be a part of their home and their family or partake of those values? The nation, or their kind of national, we evaluate this at the level of the nation or at the level of the community. Notable example in thinking about this is the case of the Amish. So in Wisconsin versus Yoder, the Amish argued that they shouldn't have to send their children to high school, as was mandated by the state of Wisconsin, because they were actually giving kids in their own schools all of the knowledge and skills they needed to be a part of their community, to be independent members of the Amish community. And so they didn't need to learn all of these things they were learning in high school. In fact, the Amish argued and won that case that they were being exposed to knowledge, when you said quotes, that was hurting their children's abilities to participate in their community. So the context of evaluation matters. But I think something else matters even once we set context and aims. And that's the institutional, social, and psychological factors that underlie the truth of these instrumental claims we make. When we say research shows X, Y, and Z leads to better educational outcomes or better labor market participation, what makes that claim true? And I don't think we often ask ourselves that question. So I'm going to give you an example to motivate this. Gintis and Bowles, the Marxist economists, did this study where they showed that in some workplaces, namely in factories and such, the workers that did well and that employers wanted were docile. That's not very surprising. If you work in a factory and you have a factory, you want workers that will just do what they're told and not complain too much. But imagine this. Imagine that we're in a society or a country or a nation in which a lot of the work is this kind of work. So say most of the jobs available are jobs in which docility is rewarded. Now we could run a crude instrumental argument in this context as well. We could say we want people to be able to have jobs because you need a job to be able to lead whatever good life you want to lead. And we have research that shows that docility is one of the dispositions that will help you get that job. You'll do better if you're docile than if you're not. And we can teach docility, right? It can be encouraged through our educational institutions. So our educational institutions should be teaching children to be docile. I think this would be very problematic, right? We would, in particular, imagine that in this situation, the reason that most of the jobs are in factories is that there's a really great inequality in the people that control the factories and own these sorts of workplaces. It's in their interest to keep the workers from asking too many questions, complaining. There's an injustice here in the background. And that's the reason that docility is beneficial. Now, if that's the reason that docility is beneficial, I don't think we can use this crude instrumental argument, because we will end up having our educational institutions reinforce an injustice that is there. It will make it worse, right? It won't make it better. Because now you have all of these students going out into the world that don't want to question authority. They don't want to, they just follow whatever the authority tells them to do. And that would lead to further injustice. So I think the crude instrumental argument as it stands can easily be subverted into this kind of situation. Okay, so how do we kind of get around this problem? So I think the way that we can get around this problem is by putting a justice conditions on instrumental claims. So we can say that only the non-cognitive dispositions that meet these conditions can be used as part of an instrumental argument. First, I think they should be broadly instrumental in leading a variety of reasonable good life against a wide background of just conditions. Not just under unjust conditions, but we have to think these are traits that are necessary to lead good lives, that are instrumental in leading good lives, even in conditions of justice. And they do not depend on potentially justice undermining conditions in order to be instrumental. So we're not exacerbating an existing injustice, as we did in the case of docility. My conjecture here is that there are going to be very few non-cognitive dispositions that pass this test. I think the ones that plausibly pass this test are those related to effective agency. So I think it's possible to think that the capacity to delay gratification, to wait for 20 minutes for the 2 marshmallows instead of 1, is probably going to serve you well, even if we're in a just society. Probably want to be able to delay gratification to pursue your goals. Plausibly perseverance, capacity to plan, to work hard, all of those I think one could make the argument that they are instrumental even under just conditions. And also those related to maintaining interpersonal relationships. For example, empathy. And I think very few other non-cognitive dispositions will meet this condition. So for example, in some studies it has been shown that assertiveness is valued in the classroom, it's valued in college classrooms. Now, you might think assertiveness is valued and rewarded because assertiveness itself is a good thing. Or you might think that it is valued because the white middle-class culture that pervades American educational institutions values assertiveness. And so they set up the classrooms to reflect those values. And in a different situation, assertiveness wouldn't be so valuable. So if you were in a collectivist, in a culture that valued collective norms instead of individualist norms, and perhaps being sociable, working with each other, those sorts of skills would be more valuable. So I don't think something like assertiveness could pass this test because it might be that in some contexts it's just valued because the people who are already in positions of power value it and they want to preserve their advantage. I think this is part of the backlash against character education. I think this is the worry they're having, that some of these character strengths are really ones that are valued because they reinforce the power of the class that is already in power, or the group that's already in power. And we can talk more about that in the Q&A. Oh, okay. So let me just go over a few conclusions I think we can draw from the research and my argument. The first, and I think there is now a tide pushing towards this conclusion, is that assessment and the way that it's conducted these days, where you just look at math scores, reading scores, etc., is not an accurate, does not give us an accurate picture of whether schools are giving students equal opportunity. For a student to have equal opportunity, they need more than just these cognitive knowledge and skills. They need some of these non-cognitive dispositions. And I think we need to also display sensitivity to justice, not just when thinking about the aims of education, where we do tend to think about justice, but also when thinking about this research. In particular, I think we need to understand why it is that some of these non-cognitive dispositions are rewarded in order to adequately assess them. Now, finally, I haven't really said anything about how to deal with the non-ideal cases. So take the case of assertiveness, right? Maybe it is rewarded just because the majority white middle class values assertiveness. But it is also true that students from certain minority backgrounds who are not assertive are being, don't have as many opportunities in virtue of that. So what do you do in that case? Even if the disposition being rewarded is one that is due to perhaps a background of injustice, there's still this question about what to do in those non-ideal conditions. And in some of my other work, I try to deal with those cases, but I think those are the toughest cases. What I think is true, though, is that a crude instrumental argument can't be deployed in these contexts without failing to be sensitive to these background conditions of injustice that often are hidden under the kind of instrumentalism that Michael was talking about. That's it. Thank you.